There we go. So, disclosure, before I actually give my actual disclosures, I don't do robotic conventional hernia repair, and I think you guys put me on here a little bit to talk, maybe rain on the parade a little bit, maybe. That's not what I'm going to do, because actually I think this is a really exciting area, and that was a really nice overview of the evidence. But I think about all the time about the issues of safety and evidence and how we can best use the evidence that we're gathering to inform clinical practice and really to make sure that as people are adopting new techniques, they do these things safely. So that's what I want to talk about, frameworks to think about that. And I think your community has done a really good job about that, and we just heard about all the really great multi-center data that's being collected around that. But I want to give a few perspectives on things that can go wrong when people maybe outside of your community start to adopt this evidence and or as you do trials and seek to learn from them, some nuances in how you can think about those sorts of things. So in terms of disclosures, I have grant funding from NIH and AHRQ. I'm also the co-founder of a company called Armamentarium, which is the platform on which AHSQC runs. So I won't talk about AHSQC during my talk. Obviously, we've heard about that before, but I'm not going to speak about that. So the take-home points here, I have kind of three main things and kind of basic things that I want to cover. So first, I think, in general, as surgeons who do a lot of innovation, and we have a lot of those in this room, we need to think carefully about making sure that it's done safely, both by us, but also as people read about what we do and pick it up in the literature. Right? It's not just the expert community that we need to worry about, it's the diffusion out into broader communities that's important. I also want to talk about, because the title of this talk was how do you measure your outcomes? It's really, really hard to measure your own surgeon outcomes. I'm going to show a little bit of data around that, but I think in general the best thing to do is to be thoughtful about multi-center data collection or collection at large centers, as you've already heard, and thoughtfully align that. And I want to walk through the ideal framework. How many people have heard of the ideal framework? A couple people. The ideal framework is a really interesting way to think about evidence as you're growing your evidence base, and is, I think, perfect to think about as you are writing these studies and categorizing where the emerging data fits into our knowledge gaps. I will say the ideal framework, a great idea. It did not diffuse as rapidly as robotic hernia repair. We'll just leave it at that. So how do we currently monitor innovation? I think we're a little bit, we don't do a lot. FDA monitors devices a little, but new procedures, there's generally nothing or very little monitoring and making sure we have good evidence to move forward and making sure we're implementing them safely. We're a little bit asleep at the wheel. I like to tell this story to exemplify that. So this was a viewpoint that a student that I work with wrote in JAMA a few years ago, and it talks about robotic prostatectomy. And the first lawsuit where Intuitive was involved that went to a jury trial. And the case here is Fred Taylor. Fred Taylor was a 60-ish-year-old guy who needed a robotic prostatectomy. And he had a surgeon who had just learned the procedure, who had 1 day of hands-on training with that, and had done 2 proctored robotic cases. And Fred Taylor was obese, and it was a very kind of multiple comorbidities, and underwent the procedure, had a missed rectal injury, and as you can imagine, that didn't play out well. Fred Taylor had a lot of comorbidities, and he eventually passed away of exacerbations of his comorbidities in this long, drawn-out post-operative course, as I'm sure you guys can all imagine and have seen that in various settings. So Mr. Taylor's family sued the hospital and the surgeon, both of which you settled, but they also sued Intuitive, which was really interesting because a manufacturer of a device generally doesn't have any legal culpability unless the machine broke in some way. Right? But we know Intuitive gets involved in the training, etc. So it was really interesting, and Intuitive actually won that first jury trial around robotic prostatectomy. Now, interestingly, this was actually lower court decision was just overturned by an appeals court, and they actually found that Intuitive was liable because they didn't adequately warn the hospital about implementing this procedure without adequate safeguards. So an interesting ongoing legal issue there. But I think the bottom line there is, as I said, we don't currently have many ways to monitor innovation, and physicians are really guided by their sense of professionalism is one of the biggest drivers, and that rolls up to, and that creates a lot of worry as you think about new things, and now you have surgeons or lawyers out there, personal injury lawyers, specifically targeting complications of robotics for lawsuits. So it's important to consider this an important motivating factor, I think. But it comes down to this. It comes down to hospital credentialing and privileging for new things. How do we think about doing that? Because that's pretty much the only safeguard when we're introducing a new procedure, is the hospital and physician credentialing. And moving on to the evidence side of this, I think a lot of times we like to just measure outcomes and say, look, I've done 5 and I didn't have any bad outcomes, everything looks great. But it's not that simple when you're measuring your own quality. And I think that the data we showed earlier were hundreds and hundreds of cases with, with significant p-values better than open. I mean, that's good data. But when you're measuring your own outcomes, I think it's really important not to get confused here, because there's a lot of things that drive outcomes. And when you want to measure your own performance, or say you want to measure performance as part of credentialing, you need to make sure you take care of all these other issues. So the observed outcomes are a function of severity of illness, which here could be how large the hernia is, or how sick the patient is. The quality of care you provided, that's the type of procedure that you do, whether it's robotic or open, et cetera. And then randomness. Now, randomness is the big issue here. Because if you're adopting this and you've done 10 cases and you want to say, look, I have 0 outcomes for 0 complications in 10 cases, look how good I am, I think that's clearly not good evidence, and we see a lot of that as people defend themselves in terms of credentialing and privileging. And so I like to tell this story, one of my favorite stories about statistics. So humans are bad at statistics. 2 guys won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. Kahneman and Tversky won the Nobel Prize for telling us that we're bad at statistics, but this is one of my favorite stories that exemplifies this. So this is Moscow during World War II. Germany bombed the heck out of Moscow, and this is kind of what was left. And the way that the people avoided getting hit by bombs is they went to neighborhood bomb shelters, and there was a commandant, a local kind of civilian commandant, who got everyone, was responsible for getting everybody into the bomb shelters. And the commandant in one particular block near the University of Moscow ran into a professor of statistics, and he said, I never see you at the bomb shelter. Why don't you come there? We don't want you to die. You're one of our most famous professors of statistics in all of Russia. And the professor of statistics says, listen, there are 9 million people in Moscow. What are the chances they're going to hit me? Right? I'm not going to go there. Only, a couple hundred people die every night. What are my chances? 2 weeks later, the commandant, this is a true story. 2 weeks later, the commandant of the bomb shelter sees this professor of statistics sitting cowering in the corner in the bomb shelter. And he goes over to the professor and says, what happened? Well, why are you here? I thought your probability was so low. And he goes, well, I found out there was 1 elephant in all of Moscow, and they got him last night. So, right, we're not good at interpreting statistics. That's actually a true story. So when we think about measuring our own performance, this is often what it looks like. Say you have some outcome of 5%, which is your SSI rate. The confidence interval around not having any bad outcomes is really wide. So as you're monitoring your own performance, keep that in mind. You say, oh, well, I've had 0% bad outcomes. It could be 0. The range around that goes from 0 to 90%. So just be thoughtful about that, and don't walk around thinking, look, I have no bad events. I'm awesome. So moving on to the ideal framework, and I think that this is really an exciting opportunity because, as I said, this framework I think is very sophisticated, very well thought out, and hasn't been adopted. And if you as a community say, we're going to adopt this ideal framework and run with it, you're like the perfect case study because you already have a lot of the pieces and component, and you have the data sources and the data collection. So I'd encourage all of you who are producing data in this to go get these 3 papers from the Lancet, read them, and start couching your data in these different stages, because it would be really, really interesting to do that and give you a nice framework to think about this, because hernias are common, and you have a lot of endpoints and a huge opportunity to kind of show people how evidence in newly emerging techniques should be done. You can set the gold standard in how this should be done. So these are the stages in the ideal recommendations, and I'm going to go through them one by one and talk about nuances, and then end each stage with kind of what's needed to be done. And I think you'll recognize that you've already done some of this. You've already achieved some of these stages, and we just heard about that. So stage 1 is this very early application of a new procedure, just as we heard about, and this is really monitored by your informed consent with your patient. And early in that, what you need is a local and national reporting infrastructure so that early experience can be documented and shared. Does that sound familiar? I think we just heard about some of that, right? As you move through idea into development, this is where you have kind of planned use, and this is where you may need IRB approval if you're doing this as part of research, where the innovation is refined. You actually map the learning curves, which is a really important thing to do because it's the evidence generated by the centers who have been doing this for 5 years and are the best isn't necessarily applicable to everybody else. And people need to know where they are in the learning curve and how many they need to do to feel safe, because we like to call this a learning curve. It's an education-focused euphemism, right? But what is that really? That's really the unnecessary patient harm curve, right? It's not a learning curve. That's what we call it. But from a patient's perspective, that gap there is morbidity. So studying this explicitly as part of your innovation process is important. And I think I haven't seen as much around the learning curve in robotic ventral hernia as I have around multi-center evidence. So exploration is the standardized use, and this is probably, we've heard some of this data in hundreds of patients. Learning curves are characterized as part of that, and then you start to do these carefully planned cohort studies, and I think that's what you're seeing now with AHSQC, et cetera. Assessment, it would be the penultimate stage, and this is where you are really thinking about comparing this to current standards. We've definitely seen some of those. I was really excited to see that there's 3 trials currently registered. But I think one of the key things when you design a trial of a new procedure is to be careful about where you say we are on, and pay careful attention to whether or not this is an efficacy trial or an effectiveness trial. And those are epidemiologic kind of jargon, but what it basically means is an efficacy trial is, does this work in the hands of the best experts? An effectiveness trial is, does this work in the general community, with a broad range of skill levels and adoption levels and people in different places on their learning curve. So be key about where your trial is in that spectrum. And I think we all know this study was a good example of one that kind of retrospectively thought about, but not prospectively, right? This was open versus laparoscopic inguinal hernia repair, and to enter the trial, you had to do 25 laparoscopic cases and get approved. Your video had to get approved that you were proficient at the procedure. But what it ended up showing was that the recurrence rate was way higher for laparoscopy, especially among people who haven't done a lot of it, right? And that's my take home of this. The few surgeons who'd done more than 250 cases actually had really low recurrence rates. And I think it was something like 25% recurrence rate for those people that were kind of newly learned, who'd met that 25 bar and started doing cases. So what we learned from this was you really need to pay attention to how good your surgeons are when you want to do a randomized trial of a surgical procedure, because it may be more about the surgeon's proficiency than it is about the procedure. And I think it's really important as we design these trials to take that into account. The final stage is long-term study. We have, I think the lap band is one of the best examples of this, right? There were a lot of short-term trials, but then people started publishing longer-term follow-up of reoperations and erosions and slippage, reoperations for poor weight loss. We just have an empiric study that we just did showed that 20% of people with a band get a reoperation, and the mean number of reoperations is 3.8 of those 20%. So monitoring things long-term, and the interesting thing about the band is it didn't even really take any data. People just kind of stopped doing it when the sleeve came along. But it's important to monitor these things long-term. I think we started to see this data come out even from large data. You can just look at reoperation rates and claims data, which doesn't have a lot of clinical detail, and you can learn a lot in terms of long-term monitoring. So my take-home points here, we need to do a good job at generating evidence as we introduce things. I wouldn't try and measure your own outcomes as an individual surgeon. Partner up with a multi-center group so you can get enough statistical power to measure things with precision. And then I really think if the AHSQC and the robotic hernia world embraces this ideal framework, you can really be one of the first case studies where you've laid your evidence on that framework as it emerged and kind of be a case study in how to do this the exact right way. So thank you.